Okay. I think that this is a decent time to talk about AoE damage in M plus with how it's been going the past couple of weeks. So it may come as a surprise to nobody that classes have been inherently imbalanced in M plus for a very long time, as AoE DPS is not something that Blizzard closely monitors. And I want to talk about like why this is like a major issue plaguing M plus just as a general game mode, and then maybe talk about the steps that Blizzard should be looking to take to fix it, and just kind of like proving that this is actually an issue, and just showing how much of a problem this realistically can be. So what we saw today, coming with the most weekly M plus change, we saw some class M plus tuning, is what I was trying to say basically, and they were adding soft caps to a lot of classes in M plus, and we actually saw this whenever something kind of similar coming into Shadowlands whenever Blizzard enacted a target cap, where they were hard capping a lot of classes at 5 targets, not letting them deal AoE damage beyond 5 targets as well. Now, this soft cap has got to be one of the fakest things I've ever seen. So a lot of these abilities for the outlier classes like Havoc Demon Hunter, Feral, they're having some of their primary AoE damage sources deal reduced damage beyond 8 or 5 targets. And in all reality, is this going to make Havoc Demon Hunter do less damage on AoE than it is currently? No. And if you've done any dungeons on the M plus beta, you know that Havoc Demon Hunter is probably the best spec in the game. And I have a newsflash. It will remain the best spec in the game. This is not a real nerf to Havoc's AoE in any capacity. Kind of similar to Feral. Feral's still probably going to be good. They nerfed Odin's Fury for Fury Warriors. Now it deals reduced damage beyond 8 targets. 8 targets is not a situation that occurs all too often. And in addition to that, soft capping these classes beyond 8 targets is not something that's going to realistically reduce their power beyond 8 targets. Or like it's going to reduce their power beyond 8 targets, but it's not going to realistically reduce their power on AoE DPS. Again, it's not really, it's like a lot of it's because the situation doesn't occur too often. In addition to that, 8 target caps are actually some of the most fake shit ever, especially if they're reduced to damage beyond 8 targets, because it just doesn't, it like the curve and like the steepness of the curve doesn't really, obviously it does accelerate some beyond 8 targets, but it's just not something that's realistically that steep. And so these classes are not going to be impacted basically any. Now, let's talk about AoE DPS balance in general and how much of a problem it realistically is. I wanted to make a video about this for a while, and now seems like a pretty good time for it. So right here, what you have on screen, and I have this because it's like the easiest to display. This is Mythic Anduin kills, and so I think that Mythic Anduin is probably one of the most similar to like M plus situations that you're going to get out of just like a raid boss. And so I have this set to 90th percentile, and you have like the common, like, let's even bump it up to 95th percentile. And you had like the common, like super strong M plus class at the very top with the Destruction Warlock and Survival Hunter, as they were obviously able to do an intense amount of AoE. And then at the bottom, you had the Beast Mastery Hunter, the Assassination Rogue, the Enhancement Shamans doing 30k DPS. And so whenever you're looking at the top, you have the Destruction Warlock and the Survival Hunter being right around that 50,000 DPS range. So I just have to pose the question, why are there multiple specs around this 30k DPS range whenever there are specs around this 50k DPS range? And there are a couple of specs around this 50k DPS range: Windwalker, Monk, Elemental Shaman, Survival Hunter, and Destruction Warlock, which is weird because Elemental Shaman wasn't seen as like super strong in 9.2, but they were obviously doing a lot of damage on Anduin specifically, and then like Frost Death Knight's like 46k. Why are there some specs that can do nearly twice the amount of DPS? And it's not exactly twice the amount of DPS, but it's nearly twice the amount of damage on a boss encounter than other specializations. It's obviously there are some things that have to do with this, such as like how damage profiles work out. But I think that the inherent imbalance in AoE, as you can see by these two specs that were clearly broken in plus as well, is also exaggerated on this encounter to the point where you do see them pulling so far ahead where they're almost doing 2 times the amount of damage. This should never happen. Whenever you go and look at single target encounters, a lot of specs are within, I mean, obviously, Windwalker Monk in 9.2 was an outlier in the bottom end. Like we didn't have a bunch of classes doing this low amount of DPS, but they're not within 30% damage band as you saw on. They're not a 30% damage band. There were not specs doing almost twice the amount of damage on single target as there were. So whenever you look here down at like Arcane Mage, Marksmanship Hunter, hell, if you even look at Windwalker Monk, the top DPS in these Fire Mage and this Feral Druid and then these Enhancement Shamans, they're not doing 20,000 DPS is the major difference here. They're doing 15,700. If they were doing 20,000 DPS, there would be a major issue in the game as well, where you wouldn't feel like you were really even able to play these other specializations because they were doing just like a substantial amount more damage than you, nearing 2 times the amount of damage. So why is it whenever we go to Anduin or we look at AoE DPS situations, there are specializations that are getting close to doing twice the amount of damage as other specializations in M+. And I mean, that's happening right now in the Dragonflight beta. I think that this is something that Blizzard absolutely should look to address, and I think it's actually one of the most, in my opinion, one of the biggest problems with M+. One of them is loot for M+ players, which I think that they've been trying to address a little bit more appropriately with the changes to how dungeons are scaling, that kind of stuff. I thought that was one of the biggest issues. Another one of the biggest issues is, I think, class balance, specifically around AoE, to the point where this is just a major problem functionally in the game, where it's not like in Raid where you're like, okay, my spec is a little bit on the undertuned side, but I can still play. Where for M+, not only are you limited in your slots because you already only have 5 slots, and so there's an issue of, there's just going to inherently be an issue of, like, there's less slots for you to just bring, and so there's obviously some tension with that. But in addition to that, there are legitimately like almost dead specs for M+. And some people will say, oh, okay, this only matters for the high end. In reality, not only does this have a trickle-down effect, but I don't really like the concept of doing half the amount of damage as like one of the meta specs. Or even if it's not half the amount of damage, if I am 25% damage overall DPS behind a meta specialization, that is such a major problem. And there are multiple times where I'm sitting on the Dragonflight beta and somebody will be like, oh, okay, this spec is fine. I saw them do 100k DPS in Algothar Academy. And then you just sit there and then you like pull up the log or the VOD, and the top spec in their group did 130k DPS or 125k DPS in Algothar Academy in the exact same run. And you're like, well, this is a major issue because a spec in the exact same run was doing 25 to 30% more damage than this other specialization. And this means that other spec, if even piloted well, and it may not be piloted well, but if it is piloted well, they're getting beat by 30%. That's a problem. And that is a major issue for overall DPS in dungeons. Blizzard, I think, should definitely be looking to more aggressively tune AoE to make sure that classes are more in line with one another. Like, it shouldn't just be, oh, okay, we're going to soft cap these classes beyond 8 targets. These are fake nerfs. Like, this is not going to shape the meta in any meaningful capacity. Havoc Demon Hunter is actually doing realistically somewhere in the order of 25 to 30% more damage than a lot of other specializations. I've seen Havoc DHs, depending on the key level and depending on the classes that are in the group, do twice the amount of damage as other specs. Like, the difference between like 50k and 100k DPS. Like the Havoc will end at 100, and some of the other spec in the group may be doing 50. Now, this could also be due to how Havoc does its damage, like whether burst damage profiles are better at lower level keys, that kind of thing. And I mean, it definitely does happen, but it shouldn't. I don't think that there ever should be a situation where specs are doing nearly twice the amount of damage than other specializations, especially on AoE. I think that we're just entering a state where M+ is like more of a legitimate in-game content source for a lot of guys. And I think that things like this cannot happen where you're forcing players to feel like they are obligated to re-roll, because if you don't, you're going to be doing somewhere in the order of like 50% less damage, and it's just a situation that it cannot exist. I think that Blizzard needs to way more aggressively tune AoE and tune around AoE. And I don't think we're entering an era anymore where it's about, oh, okay, on this one raid fight, this one specialization was good at AoE. Like, I don't think that can be a thing realistically either, where, Moonkins are blowing people out of the water on just one specific raid encounter. That shouldn't be happening. In the exact same vein, like M plus specs, two M plus specs should not be doing twice the amount of damage as other specializations. And it's not just like, oh, okay, this is just an outlier in the low end. Only Beast Mastery Hunter was doing 30k DPS. No, there are legitimately 5 specs at the 95th percentile here. We're doing 30k DPS. All right. I think I'm done with this rant. Overall, I think that M plus and AoE balancing needs to be looked at. It needs to be done more frequently, and Blizzard needs to more aggressively monitor the situation with AoE balance just in general. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.